Directional terms. Directional terms are essential for describing the relative locations of different body structures. For instance, an anatomist might describe one band of tissue as inferior to another, or a physician might describe a tumor as superficial to a deeper body structure. Commit these terms to memory to avoid confusion when you are studying or describing the locations of particular body parts. Anterior or ventral describes the front or direction towards the front of the body. The toes are anterior to the foot. Posterior or dorsal describes the back or direction towards the back of the body. The popliteus is posterior to the patella. Superior or cranial describes a position above or higher than another part of the body. The orbits are superior to the oris. Inferior or caudal describes a position below or lower than another part of the body proper, near or toward the tail in humans, the coccyx, or lowest part of the spinal column. The pelvis is inferior to the abdomen. Lateral describes the side or direction toward the side of the body. The thumb, pollex, is lateral to the digits. Medial describes the middle or direction toward the middle of the body. The hallux is the medial toe. Proximal describes a position in a limb that is nearer to the point of attachment or the trunk of the body. The brachium is proximal to the antebrachium. Distal describes a position in a limb that is farther from the point of attachment or the trunk of the body. The crus is distal to the femur. Superficial describes a position closer to the surface of the body. The skin is superficial to the bones. Deep describes a position farther from the surface of the body. The brain is deep to the skull. Body planes. A section is a two-dimensional surface of a three-dimensional structure that has been cut. Modern medical imaging devices enable clinicians to obtain virtual sections of living bodies. We call these scans. Body sections and scans can be correctly interpreted, however, only if the viewer understands the plane along which the section was made. A plane is an imaginary two-dimensional surface that passes through the body. There are three planes commonly referred to in the anatomy and medicine. The sagittal plane is the plane that divides the body or an organ vertically into right and left sides. If this vertical plane runs directly down the middle of the body, it is called the mid-sagittal or median plane. If it divides the body into unequal right and left sides, it is called a parasagittal plane, or less commonly, a longitudinal section. The frontal plane is the plane that divides the body or an organ into an anterior front portion and a posterior rear portion. The frontal plane is often referred to as a coronal plane. Coronal is Latin for crown. The transverse plane is the plane that divides the body or organ horizontally into upper and lower portions. Transverse planes produce images referred to as cross sections. Body cavities and serous membranes. The body maintains its internal organization by means of membranes, sheaths, and other structures that separate compartments. The dorsal posterior cavity and the ventral anterior cavity are the largest body compartments. These cavities contain and protect delicate interior organs, and the ventral cavity allows for significant changes in the size and shape of the organs as they perform their functions. The lungs, heart, stomach, and intestines, for example, can expand and contract without distorting other tissues or disrupting the activity of nearby organs. Subdivisions of the posterior dorsal and anterior ventral cavities. The posterior dorsal and anterior ventral cavities are each subdivided into smaller cavities. The posterior dorsal cavity has two main subdivisions. The posterior dorsal cavity, the cranial cavity, houses the brain, protected by the bones of the skull and cerebrospinal fluid. The spinal cavity or vertebral cavity encloses the spinal cord, protected by the vertebral column and the cerebrospinal fluid. The anterior or ventral cavity has two main subdivisions. The thoracic cavity is the more superior subdivision of the anterior cavity and is enclosed by the rib cage. The thoracic cavity contains the lungs and the heart, which is located in the mediastinum. The diaphragm forms the floor of the thoracic cavity and separates it from the inferior abdominopelvic cavity. The abdominopelvic cavity is the largest cavity in the body. No membrane physically divides the abdominopelvic cavity. The abdominal cavity houses the digestive organs, the pelvic cavity, and the reproductive organs. To promote clear communication, for instance, about the location of a patient's abdominal pain or suspicious mass, healthcare providers typically divide up the cavity of the abdomen into either 9 regions or 4 quadrants. Tissue membranes. A tissue membrane is a thin layer or sheet of cells that covers the outside of the body. For example, skin, the organs, for example, pericardium, internal passageways that lead to the exterior of the body, for example, abdominal mesenteries, and the lining of the movable joint cavities. There are 2 basic types of tissue membranes: connective tissue and epithelial membranes. Connective tissue membranes. The connective tissue membrane is formed solely from connective tissue. These membranes encapsulate organs such as the kidneys and line our movable joints. A synovial membrane is a type of connective tissue membrane that lines the cavity of a freely movable joint. For example, synovial membranes surround the joints of the shoulder, elbow, and knee. Epithelial membranes. The epithelial membrane is composed of epithelium attached to a layer of connective tissue. For example, your skin. The mucous membrane is also a composite of connective and epithelial tissue, sometimes called mucosa. These epithelial membranes line the body cavities and hollow passageways that open to the external environment and include the digestive, respiratory, excretory, and reproductive tracts. Mucus, produced by the epithelial exocrine glands, cover the epithelial layer. The underlying connective tissue, called the lamina propria, helps support the fragile epithelial layer. The skin is an epithelial membrane, also called the cutaneous membrane. It is a stratified squamous epithelial membrane resting on top of connective tissue. The apical surface of this membrane is exposed to the external environment and is covered with dead, keratinized cells that help protect the body from desiccation and pathogens. Membranes of the anterior or ventral body cavity. A serous membrane, also referred to as serosa, is an epithelial membrane composed of mesodermally derived epithelium called the mesothelium that is supported by connective tissue. These membranes line the coulommic cavities of the body, and they cover the organs located within those cavities. They are essentially membranous bags with mesothelium lining the inside and connective tissue on the outside. Parietal layers line the walls of the body cavity. Visceral layer covers the organs, the viscera. And between the parietal and visceral layers is a very thin fluid-filled serous space. There are 3 serous cavities and their associated membranes. Serous membranes provide additional protection to the visceral. They enclose by reducing friction that could lead to inflammation of the organs. Pleura surrounds the lungs in the pleural cavity and reduces friction between the lungs and the body wall. Pericardium surrounds the heart in the pericardial cavity and reduces friction between the heart and the wall of the pericardium. And the peritoneum surrounds several organs in the abdominopelvic cavity. The peritoneal cavity reduces friction between the abdominal and pelvic organs and the body wall.